A mother and her 11-year-old daughter went grocery shopping on a Sunday evening. That's it. That's how this began. No dark alley, no stranger with a weapon, just a supermarket, a parking lot, and two men who decided in that moment that this family would be theirs to destroy. By the next morning, 3 members of that family would be dead, their home reduced to ash, and a state would be forced to ask how 2 convicted criminals, both supposedly under active government supervision, were free to do this at all. This is the story of the Petit family, and it's one of the hardest stories we've ever told on this channel. Welcome back to Buried Truth Crime. If you're new here, we tell true crime stories the way they deserve to be told, with accuracy, with context, and with respect for the real people at the center of them. If that sounds like your kind of channel, go ahead and hit subscribe before we get into tonight's case, because this one is going to stay with you. Let's start with who this family actually was, because understanding what was taken makes it impossible to look away from what happened next. Dr. William Petit Jr. was, by every account, a pillar of his community. Born in Southampton, Connecticut, he grew up in a household where public service was simply expected. His father ran the town's general store and sat on both the school board and the town council. William followed a more clinical path, training as a physician and eventually building a respected endocrinology practice in Plainville, Connecticut, a practice he had run since the late 1980s. It was during his medical training in Pittsburgh that he met Jennifer Hawk, a young oncology nurse working at the same hospital. Their connection was immediate, and they married in the spring of 1985. Jennifer would go on to become co-director of the health center at a private boarding school, where generations of students remembered her not just as competent, but as genuinely kind, the kind of nurse who made frightened teenagers feel safe. What most people around her didn't dwell on, because she never let them, was that Jennifer had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. She didn't hide it, and she didn't let it define her either. Instead, she turned her diagnosis into purpose, becoming deeply involved in fundraising and advocacy for MS research. That mission would become something her whole family rallied around. Their 2 daughters carried that spirit forward, each in her own way. Haley, the eldest, was 17 years old in the summer of 2007. She was the kind of teenager parents hope for and rarely get to see all at once. A varsity athlete who ran cross-country, played basketball, and rode crew, all while maintaining a spot on the high honor roll. She had just graduated from a prestigious private school, where she'd also been elected to a senior leadership position. She'd been accepted into Dartmouth College, her father's alma mater, with plans to study medicine. But if you'd asked Haley what she was proudest of, it wasn't the grades or the trophies. It was the fundraising team she captained in her mother's honor, walking to fight multiple sclerosis, a cause she'd made entirely her own. Michaela, the youngest, was 11. She was the family's creative heart, a kid who loved to cook, who was already planning elaborate dinners for people twice her age to enjoy. She told her family that once Haley left for college, she wanted to take over leadership of the MS fundraising team herself and rename it in her own honor. She never got the chance. This was a family that had built something real: faith, community, purpose, and each other. And on a quiet street called Sorghum Mill Road, they had no idea they'd already caught the attention of 2 men capable of unthinkable cruelty. Let's talk about those 2 men, because their backgrounds matter. Not to excuse anything, nothing excuses what's coming, Sidi, but because their history exposes exactly how this tragedy became possible in the first place. Joshua Komisarjevsky was 26 years old in the summer of 2007. He'd been adopted into a family with deep ties to the arts, and on paper his upbringing looked nothing like a pipeline to violence. But by his mid-20s, he had accumulated a long string of burglary convictions and a documented history of substance abuse. He was, at the time of this crime, on parole. Stephen Hayes was 44, with a criminal record stretching back more than 2 decades to a burglary conviction from when he was still a teenager. Court records later painted a disturbing picture of a man with a long documented pattern of cruelty, one that reportedly began in childhood. Like Komisarjevsky, Hayes was also on parole, technically under the supervision of a system designed specifically to prevent exactly what he was about to do. The two men had met through a halfway house drug treatment program. 2 convicted felons, both meant to be monitored, both free to walk the streets of Cheshire, Connecticut, on the night that changed everything. On the evening of Sunday, July 22, 2007, Jennifer Petit took Michaela to a local supermarket. Michaela was excited. She was picking out ingredients for a special dinner she wanted to cook for her family that night. It was an ordinary errand, the kind that happens in every town every day without a second thought. Except that evening someone was watching. Investigators would later determine that one of the 2 men spotted Jennifer and Michaela in the store and followed them home, learning the layout of their street, the timing of their evening, the shape of their lives, all in the space of 1 car ride. That night, the 2 men exchanged a series of text messages. Prosecutors would later present those messages in court as damning evidence because they weren't vague or coded. They were casual, almost gleeful, discussing what they were about to do as though they were planning a night out rather than a home invasion. This wasn't an impulsive decision made in the heat of the moment. This was premeditated, and the evidence proved it. In the early hours of Monday, July 23rd, the 2 men broke into the Petit home. Dr. Petit had fallen asleep downstairs after watching television. He woke to a violent blow to the head. He was dragged to the basement, bound and beaten repeatedly, left bleeding and disoriented but somehow still conscious. Upstairs, Jennifer, Haley, and Michaela were separated from one another, each tied to her own bed. The men told them this was simply a robbery, that if the family cooperated, no one would get hurt. It was a lie, repeated again and again over the hours that followed, a tactic to keep 3 terrified people compliant while something far darker was being decided. For roughly 7 hours, this family endured captivity in their own home. The intruders searched for money, for credit cards, for anything of value, all while keeping the family bound and separated. At some point during the night, one of the men left briefly and drove to a nearby gas station, purchasing gasoline in containers taken from the family's own garage. At the time, there was no obvious reason for it. In hindsight, it was the clearest possible sign of what these men had already decided to do. As morning broke, the 2 men made a decision that would ultimately lead to their capture. They forced Jennifer into her own car and drove her to a nearby bank, intending to force a large cash withdrawal. It was around 9 in the morning when they arrived. Jennifer was terrified, but she was also sharp enough in the middle of the worst morning of her life to see an opportunity. Inside the bank, she managed to communicate to an employee that something was seriously wrong. That employee recognized the danger immediately and called emergency services. Within minutes, police had a vehicle description and a plate number, and officers were racing toward both the bank and the Petit home. For a moment, it looked like help might arrive in time. It didn't. While Jennifer was gone, the situation inside the house grew even more horrific. Court testimony later confirmed that both Jennifer and Michaela were sexually assaulted by the intruders. We're not going to describe what happened in graphic detail because these were real people and their dignity matters more than shock value ever could. What matters is this: the men inside that house had never intended to simply take money and leave. They had planned something far more permanent from the very beginning. When Hayes returned with Jennifer and the stolen money, the 2 men doused the house in the gasoline purchased hours earlier. They poured it around the beds where Haley and Michaela were still tied. Then they set the house on fire. Jennifer didn't die in the flames. She was strangled before the fire could reach her. Haley, 17, and Michaela, 11, died of smoke inhalation as the fire spread through the home around them. In the basement, Dr. Petit was still bound but conscious, and the smell of smoke reached him before help ever could. Despite his severe injuries, he found the strength to work himself free of his restraints. He crawled to a small basement window, kicked it open, and pulled himself out into a neighbor's yard where he collapsed, bloodied and barely conscious but alive. Cheshire police arrived to find the house already burning. As officers approached, they saw two men exit the home and get into a car in the driveway, attempting to flee the scene. When the suspects tried to ram their vehicle past police cruisers to escape, the collision disabled their car and ended the chase before it began. Both men were taken into custody at gunpoint, right there in the driveway of the house they had just set on fire. When firefighters finally brought the blaze under control and were able to safely enter, they found 3 bodies inside. Jennifer, Haley, and Michaela had all died in that house. Dr. William Petit was the only member of his family to survive. If this story has you as shaken as it had us while researching it, take a second right now to like this video and leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from tonight. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling these stories the right way. Now let's talk about what happened in the courtroom. The case against both men was, in the words of prosecutors, overwhelming. Surveillance footage placed Hayes at the bank with Jennifer and at the gas station buying the gasoline used in the fire. The text messages exchanged the night before established clear premeditation. Forensic evidence from the scene, including the rope, the restraints, and the burn patterns consistent with an accelerant, corroborated every element of the timeline. Toxicology reports confirmed that neither man had drugs or alcohol in his system at the time of the crime. There would be no intoxication defense. Both men had been fully aware of what they were doing every step of the way. One day after the murders, both suspects were formally arraigned, charged with kidnapping, burglary, arson, robbery, larceny, and assault. Within days, prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty, and both men were charged with capital felony counts under Connecticut law, as it stood at the time. Stephen Hayes was tried first. His trial began in September of 2010, more than 3 years after the murders. In early October of that year, a jury found him guilty on every count. The following month, that same jury recommended the death penalty, and in December of 2010, a judge formally sentenced Hayes to death. Joshua Komisarjevsky's trial began the following September in 2011. Jurors heard his own recorded confession, reviewed the same body of text messages, and heard forensic testimony connecting him directly to the crimes inside that house. His defense attempted to present evidence of abuse he'd suffered as a child, hoping it might soften his sentence. The jury was not moved. Komisarjevsky, too, was convicted and sentenced to death. For a while, it seemed like the story might end there, with both men awaiting execution on Connecticut's death row. But the legal story of this case wasn't over. In April of 2012, Connecticut passed legislation abolishing the death penalty for any crime committed after that date. It didn't apply retroactively, so Hayes and Komisarjevsky, whose crimes predated the new law, technically remained on death row. But in 2015, the Connecticut Supreme Court issued a landmark ruling finding that executing prisoners for crimes committed before the state's own death penalty repeal would amount to cruel and unusual punishment under the state constitution. Every death sentence in Connecticut, including these two, was converted to life imprisonment without the possibility of release. In June of 2016, Stephen Hayes was formally resentenced to 6 consecutive life terms without parole, along with more than a century of additional time on related charges. The presiding judge's words at that resentencing were blunt and final. Given the gravity of the crimes and the depravity of the defendant's character, nothing more needed to be said. 1 month later, in July of 2016, Joshua Komisarjevsky received the identical sentence. 6 consecutive life terms, no possibility of parole, no possibility of release. Both men will spend the remainder of their lives in prison. The case left a permanent mark on Cheshire and on Connecticut as a whole. 5 days after the murders, thousands of people gathered at a memorial service where Dr. Petit stood in front of a grieving community and eulogized his wife and daughters. Months later, in January of 2008, more than 130,000 candles were lit across the town in an event that came to be known as the Cheshire Lights of Hope, a tribute to Jennifer, Haley, and Michaela that drew people from across the state. Out of that grief came the Petit Family Foundation, an organization Dr. Petit built to carry on the causes his wife and daughters had cared about most, particularly education and multiple sclerosis research. He became, in the years that followed, one of the most vocal advocates in the country for parole reform, testifying before lawmakers about the supervision failures that had allowed 2 convicted felons, both technically under state monitoring, to walk free and commit this crime. His advocacy contributed directly to legislative changes in Connecticut, tightening parole requirements and increasing oversight of high-risk offenders. The case also became one of the defining flashpoints in Connecticut's death penalty debate, a debate that continues to this day. Many victims' rights advocates, including Dr. Petit himself, believed both men deserved execution and viewed the conversion of their sentences to life imprisonment as a failure of justice. Others viewed the state Supreme Court's ruling as a principled, if difficult, stand, arguing that a state that had already decided capital punishment was wrong going forward couldn't fairly continue applying it only to older cases. There's no easy answer here, and both sides of that argument still point to this exact case when they make it. What's not up for debate is who Jennifer, Haley, and Michaela Petit actually were. Jennifer was a caregiver who spent her life looking after other people, even while quietly managing her own illness. Haley was on the edge of an extraordinary future, accepted into an Ivy League school, already building a legacy of service before she'd even graduated high school. And Michaela, at just 11 years old, was still becoming who she was going to be. A kid whose biggest ambition was to keep her sister's charitable work alive. They should have had decades left. Instead, their names became attached to one of the most devastating home invasions in American history. A case that exposed real systemic failures in how this country monitors people who've already proven themselves dangerous. In the years since, this case has been studied by criminologists, cited in parole policy reviews, and taught in law schools as an example of what happens when a supervision system exists on paper but fails in practice. Both Hayes and Komisarjevsky had records that should have raised red flags long before that summer night. Both were supposed to be checking in with parole officers. Both were supposed to be accounted for. And yet neither man's whereabouts on the night of July 22nd were flagged by anyone until it was already far too late. That's part of what makes this case so difficult to sit with. It's not just a story about 2 violent men. It's a story about every small failure that has to line up, one after another, for a tragedy this size to happen at all. A missed check-in, an overloaded parole officer, a system built for volume instead of vigilance. None of those failures caused this crime on their own. But together they created the conditions that let 2 dangerous men remain free long enough to choose a target, plan an attack, and carry it out over the better part of a night. Dr. Petit has spent much of the time since working to make sure those same gaps get closed for the next family wherever they are. That work doesn't undo what happened on Sorghum Mill Road. Nothing could. But it's the closest thing to meaning that can be pulled from a night this senseless. That's the story of the Petit family and the 2 men who took everything from them in a single night. If this case affected you the way it affected us, make sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss the next investigation from Buried Truth Crime. Drop a comment below and let us know what you think justice should look like in a case like this one. And as always, stay safe out there. We'll see you in the next one.